The father who created the monster's sisters. That's what the old court records call Josiah Miller, a man whose horrible sexual practices destroyed his daughters in the remote Ozark Mountains of 1885. But the true horror wasn't just what he did to 18-year-old Alara and 16-year-old Maeve behind the walls of that isolated farmhouse. It was what they became because of it. The sisters who chained their father in his own cellar, who castrated him with farming tools while he screamed into the mountain silence, who fled into the wilderness and learned to hunt a different kind of prey, men who reminded them of their father, men who trusted their innocent faces and gentle voices, men who never saw death coming until it was too late. Sheriff Brody found the father's rotting corpse first, then the trail of missing men across 3 counties, bodies that told a story no one wanted to believe, that victims could become something far more terrifying than their tormentor ever was. But when 2 broken girls become cold-blooded killers, who was the real monster, and how far will they go before someone stops them? The autumn of 1885 settled over the Ozark Mountains like a burial shroud, painting the ancient hills in shades of rust and gold that would have been beautiful anywhere else. But beauty had no place on the Miller farm, where the very air seemed to hold its breath against the horrors that festered within those weathered wooden walls. The farm sat in a hollow between 2 ridges, isolated by design and maintained by fear, a place where screams died before they could travel beyond the tree line and where the outside world existed only as a distant, impossible dream. Alara Miller moved through her morning chores with the mechanical precision of someone who had learned that survival depended on invisibility. At 18, she carried herself with the careful grace of a deer in hunting season, her movements calculated to avoid drawing attention from the man who ruled their world with fists and worse. Her auburn hair was pulled back severely, and her gray dress hung loose on a frame that had never been allowed to fill out properly, the result of years spent giving her smaller portions to her younger sister. Every morning was the same routine, every day a testament to endurance, every sunset a small victory simply for having survived another day in hell. The barn offered the only refuge from the oppressive atmosphere of the house, where their father's presence lingered even when he was absent, like smoke from a fire that could never be fully extinguished. Alara preferred the company of the few scrawny chickens and the old milk cow to the suffocating silence that filled the rooms where unspeakable things happened after dark. It was while gathering eggs from the nests, her hands working automatically through a task she had performed thousands of times, that her fingers brushed against something that did not belong, hidden. Beneath the straw in the corner nest, wrapped carefully in a piece of faded cloth, lay a small wooden bird. The carving was simple but skillful, no larger than her palm, depicting a sparrow in flight, with wings spread wide as if caught in the moment of escape. She recognized it immediately as the work of the traveling tinker who had stopped at their farm 3 months prior, a kind-faced man with gentle hands who had offered to mend their broken plow in exchange for a meal and a place to sleep. Josiah had turned him away with curses and threats, as he did all outsiders who might glimpse the truth of their existence. But somehow, the man had managed to leave this small token of kindness behind. Alara's hands trembled as she held the carved bird, feeling its smooth surface worn soft by loving attention to detail. For the first time in years, something inside her chest that she had thought long dead began to stir. Hope. The dangerous, foolish emotion that had been beaten out of her countless times rose like a phoenix from ashes, whispering impossible promises of a world beyond these hills, a life where birds could fly freely and girls could walk in sunlight without fear. She pressed the carving to her heart and allowed herself, for just one precious moment, to imagine wings of her own. The fantasy shattered like glass against stone when Josiah's voice roared across the farmyard, thick with the whiskey that had become his constant companion and sharp with the particular rage that preceded his worst cruelties. "Where is that worthless girl? Alara, get in this house before I come looking for you." She tucked the wooden bird into her apron pocket and ran toward the house, knowing that delay would only make the inevitable worse. But Josiah was already waiting on the porch, his massive frame blocking the doorway like a mountain of malice. His eyes, bloodshot and wild, fixed on the slight bulge in her apron with the predatory focus of a hawk spotting prey. "What's that you're hiding, girl? Turn out your pockets." The wooden bird fell to the porch boards with a soft thud that might as well have been a thunderclap. Josiah's face transformed into something inhuman as he recognized the carving, remembering the tinker he had driven away, and the defiance implicit in this small act of kindness. His hand struck her face with a sound like a gunshot, sending her sprawling across the rough wooden planks. But the physical blow was nothing compared to what followed. "You think you can bring shame on this family? You think you can invite strangers to look at what's mine?" His boot caught her in the ribs, driving the air from her lungs in a painful gasp. "I'll teach you about keeping secrets, you ungrateful little whore." The beating that followed was worse than usual, each blow calculated to cause maximum pain without permanent damage, delivered with the practiced expertise of a man who had perfected the art of inflicting suffering. Ilara curled into a ball on the porch, protecting her head and vital organs, while the storm of violence raged over her, each impact a reminder of her powerlessness, each cruel word a nail in the coffin of her briefly resurrected hope. From inside the house, Maeve watched through the window with eyes that burned like coals in a furnace. At 16, she had inherited her father's capacity for rage, but lacked his outlets for it, leaving her with a fury that turned inward and festered like an infected wound. She saw her sister's blood on the porch boards, saw the wooden bird crushed under their father's heel, saw the light die in Ilara's eyes once again, and something cold and final settled in her chest like winter frost. That night, after Josiah had drunk himself into his usual stupor and the house had settled into its familiar pattern of fearful silence, the sisters met in the kitchen without words. They had developed their own language of glances and gestures over the years, a way of communicating that bypassed the ears of their tormentor. Tonight, that silent conversation carried the weight of a death sentence. Ilara's face was swollen and discolored, her lips split, and her left eye nearly swollen shut, but her remaining eye burned with something that had not been there that morning. Maeve reached across the table and took her sister's hand, their fingers intertwining in a grip that spoke of unbreakable bonds forged in shared suffering. No words were needed to express what they both understood. The time for endurance had passed, the season of reckoning had arrived. Together they descended into the cellar, their bare feet silent on the stone steps that led down into the earth where their father stored his whiskey and kept his tools. The candlelight flickered across their pale faces, transforming their features into masks of determination that would have been beautiful if not for the terrible purpose behind them. In the shadows of that underground chamber, surrounded by the implements of farm work that could serve other purposes, the Miller sisters began to sharpen more than just metal edges. They sharpened their resolve, their courage, and their appetite for the justice that the world above had denied them for far too long. The cellar had become a tomb for the living, its stone walls weeping moisture that mingled with other darker stains as dawn crept across the Ozark hillsides above. Josiah Miller hung suspended between the iron rings his grandfather had hammered into the rock for storing meat, his wrists bound with the same rope he had once used to tie his daughters when their screams grew too loud for his comfort. But now it was his voice that filled the underground chamber with sounds that would haunt these walls long after his body had surrendered to whatever fate awaited him in the darkness. Ilara moved with the mechanical precision of a surgeon, her hands steady despite the magnitude of what they had done in the hours before sunrise. The old kitchen knife, sharpened to a razor's edge on her father's own whetstone, caught the candlelight as she cleaned it with the same methodical care she had once used to prepare his meals. Beside her, Maeve sat on an overturned crate, her dress stained with evidence of their terrible work, watching their father's agonized writhing with eyes that held no trace of pity or remorse. "He's still breathing," Maeve observed, with the detached curiosity of a child examining an insect she had pulled the wings from. Her voice carried none of the trembling that had once accompanied her father's approach, none of the fear that had defined every word she had spoken in his presence. Instead, there was something cold and final in her tone, as if she were commenting on the weather or the state of the chickens in the yard above. Elara nodded and continued her grim ministrations, binding the wounds with strips torn from one of her father's own shirts. The irony was not lost on her that she was now tending to injuries she had inflicted, showing a mercy he had never demonstrated in all the years of their captivity. But this was not compassion driving her careful work. It was the practical knowledge that a quick death would have been too kind, too simple an end for the man who had stolen their childhoods and twisted their souls into shapes that could conceive and execute such calculated vengeance. "We need to leave before the sun is fully up," Elara said, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had taken charge of their destiny for the first time in her life. "The Hendersons might come by today to check on the boundary fence, and if they hear him—" She gestured toward their father, whose moans had settled into a rhythmic pattern of suffering that seemed to echo from the very stones themselves. They had planned this moment for weeks, ever since that night when the wooden bird had been crushed under Josiah's boot, and something irreversible had crystallized between them. Every detail had been considered, from the timing of their attack when whiskey had rendered him most vulnerable, to the supplies they would need for their escape into the wilderness that stretched beyond the familiar boundaries of their prison. Maeve had sewn hidden pockets into their traveling dresses, while Elara had slowly gathered their father's meager savings from the places where he thought they could never find them. The horse stood saddled and ready in the pre-dawn gloom, their few possessions secured in saddlebags that had once carried their father's trips to town. As they prepared to mount, Elara felt the weight of the wooden bird in her pocket, retrieved from the porch where it had been trampled but not destroyed, its tiny carved wings still spread in eternal flight. The symbolism was not lost on her. They too were finally free to fly, though their wings had been forged in blood and tempered in an unforgivable fire. The first hours of their journey passed in relative silence, broken only by the steady rhythm of hoofbeats on the narrow mountain trails that snaked through valleys where morning mist clung to the hollows like spirits of the dead. Behind them, the Miller farm grew smaller and more distant with each mile, until it disappeared entirely behind the rolling peaks that had once defined the limits of their world. Ahead lay only the unknown, vast and dangerous, but infinitely preferable to the certainty of what they were leaving behind. The deeper they rode into the Ozark wilderness, the more the landscape itself seemed to conspire against easy passage. Ancient trees pressed close to the trail, their branches forming a canopy so thick that midday felt like twilight, while thorny underbrush caught at their skirts and threatened to unseat them from their precarious perch on the stolen horse. Every sound seemed magnified in the oppressive quiet, the snap of a twig, the cry of a distant bird, the whisper of wind through leaves, transforming their flight into a journey through a world where danger lurked behind every shadow. It was near midday when they encountered the trapper, a lean man with grizzled features and eyes that seemed to catalog every detail of their appearance with uncomfortable intensity. He emerged from the forest like a specter, his sudden presence causing their horse to shy and nearly throw them from the saddle. His greeting was friendly enough, but there was something in his manner that set their nerves on edge, a familiarity that suggested he knew more about the isolated homesteads in these hills than strangers should. "Afternoon, ladies," he said, tipping his hat with exaggerated courtesy. "Mighty unusual to see young women traveling these trails alone. Where might you be headed on such a fine day?" His smile revealed teeth stained brown with tobacco, and his gaze lingered on their faces with the kind of attention that brought back memories they were trying to escape. Elara felt Maeve tense behind her on the horse, her sister's hands tightening on her waist, in a grip that communicated volumes without words. They had prepared a story for such encounters, but under the trapper's scrutiny, The lies felt transparent as glass. "We're traveling to visit relatives in the next county," Ilara managed, keeping her voice steady despite the hammering of her heart. "Our uncle is expecting us before nightfall." The trapper nodded slowly, but his eyes never left their faces, studying them with the patience of a hunter who had learned to read the signs of prey in flight. "Long way to travel without an escort," he observed, stepping closer to their horse. "These mountains can be dangerous for folks who don't know their way around. Might be I could guide you to the main road. Make sure you don't get lost in these backwoods." The offer hung in the air between them like a trap waiting to be sprung, and Maeve's whispered "no" was barely audible, but carried the weight of absolute refusal. Ilara quickly declined the man's assistance, spurring their horse forward with perhaps more haste than wisdom, leaving the trapper standing in the trail behind them with questions written across his weathered features, and the kind of curiosity that could prove fatal to fugitives who had already crossed lines from which there could be no return. 3 weeks of hard travel through the unforgiving Ozark wilderness had transformed the Miller sisters from frightened refugees into something altogether more dangerous. The mining town of Copper Falls emerged from the morning mist like a mirage of civilization, its ramshackle buildings clinging to the mountainside with the desperate tenacity of barnacles on a storm-battered ship. It was exactly the kind of place they needed, a community built on transience and anonymity, where questions were considered bad manners, and the past was something best left buried in the played-out mine shafts that honeycombed the surrounding hills. Ilara and Maeve rode into town on their stolen horse with the practiced composure of young women who had learned to wear masks long before they had learned to remove them. They had shed their old selves somewhere in the wilderness between their father's farm and this moment, emerging as Sarah and Mary Whitfield, recently orphaned sisters from the eastern counties who had lost everything to a fever outbreak and sought nothing more than honest work and a chance to rebuild their shattered lives. The lie came so naturally to Ilara's lips that she almost believed it herself, the fabricated tragedy feeling more real than the truth they carried like a poison in their veins. The boarding house stood at the end of Main Street like a fortress against respectability, a 3-story monument to the kind of establishments that thrived in places where men came to lose themselves in drink, gambling, and the temporary companionship of women who asked no questions about the blood under their fingernails or the guilt in their eyes. Mrs. Blackwood, the proprietress, was a woman whose own past clearly contained chapters she preferred to keep closed, and she accepted the sisters' story with the weary pragmatism of someone who understood that survival sometimes required reinvention. "Can you cook, clean, and keep your mouth shut about what you might see or hear?" she asked, her sharp eyes studying them with the intensity of a jeweler evaluating stones of uncertain value. When they nodded their assent, she continued with the kind of practical wisdom that came from years of managing men at their worst. "Then you can stay. Room and board plus $2 a week each, and if any of the guests get too friendly, you come to me directly. I run a respectable establishment, and I won't have my girls treated like common whores." The work itself was familiar enough: cooking, cleaning, serving meals to men who reeked of sweat and desperation, changing sheets that told stories their occupants would never speak aloud. But it was in those first weeks at the boarding house that the sisters began to recognize the patterns that would define their new purpose. They watched the miners and drifters who filled the rooms, studied their habits and weaknesses, with the clinical detachment of naturalists observing specimens in their native habitat. Some were decent enough men broken by circumstance and hardship, but others carried with them the same casual cruelty that had defined their father, the same assumption that women existed solely for their convenience and pleasure. It was Seamus O'Malley who became their first victim, though he would never know the honor of that designation. A brutal Irish miner with fists like ham hocks and a voice that could be heard 3 streets away when he was drunk, O'Malley had made himself notorious throughout Copper Falls for his treatment of the Chinese workers in the mines and his tendency to use his hands on any woman unfortunate enough to find herself within reach. He reminded Maeve of their father in the way he moved through the world, taking up more space than he deserved and expecting others to accommodate his appetites without question. The opportunity presented itself on a Thursday evening when O'Malley had consumed enough whiskey to make him sentimental and dangerous in equal measure. He cornered Alara in the kitchen, his massive frame blocking her escape, while his hands wandered with the confidence of a man who had never faced consequences for his actions. "Pretty little thing like you shouldn't be working so hard," he slurred, his breath reeking of alcohol and tobacco. "Why don't you bring a bottle up to my room later, and we can discuss your future employment prospects?" But it was Maeve who appeared in the doorway with a smile that would have frozen the blood of anyone sober enough to recognize it for what it was. "That sounds like a wonderful idea, Mr. O'Malley," she said with honey-sweet venom. "Sarah here was just telling me how much she's been looking forward to getting to know you better. Weren't you, sister?" The look that passed between them carried the weight of their shared understanding, the unspoken communication that had developed in the years when words were too dangerous to speak aloud. An hour later, O'Malley was sprawled across his narrow bed with a bottle of poisoned whiskey in his lifeless hand and the expression of confused surprise frozen on his face for eternity. The sisters worked with the same methodical efficiency they had demonstrated in their father's cellar, stripping the room of anything valuable before wrapping the body in the stained sheets that would serve as both shroud and evidence of his final fatal mistake. The abandoned mine shaft on the outskirts of town provided the perfect tomb for their handiwork, a vertical grave that dropped into darkness so complete it seemed to swallow sound itself. As they watched O'Malley's wrapped corpse disappear into the depths, both sisters felt something awaken in their hearts that was equal parts satisfaction and hunger. This was justice, they told themselves, the kind of reckoning that the world above ground was too cowardly to deliver. In the weeks that followed, their methods became more sophisticated, their selection of victims more deliberate. They learned to read the signs that marked men as worthy of their particular brand of justice, the casual violence, the assumption of privilege, the way certain types of males moved through the world as if it owed them everything, and they owed it nothing in return. The boarding house became their hunting ground, and they its most gracious hostesses, offering comfort and companionship to travelers who would never live to describe their hospitality to others. Each death strengthened the bond between them while simultaneously deepening the chasm that separated them from the rest of humanity. They were no longer victims of circumstance, but architects of their own terrible destiny, women who had discovered that the power to take life could be just as intoxicating as the powerlessness they had once endured. In the twisted logic of their shared trauma, they had found a purpose that justified their existence and transformed their pain into something that felt dangerously close to righteousness. The stench of death had settled over the Miller farm like a curse by the time Reverend Timothy Hawthorne arrived on his monthly circuit through the remote homesteads of the Arkansas counties. The traveling preacher had made this journey for 15 years, bringing salvation to souls scattered across valleys where organized religion was as scarce as honest lawmen, but nothing in his experience had prepared him for the horror that waited in the cellar of the isolated farmstead he had visited countless times before. The house above ground told its own story of abandonment, doors hanging open, chickens pecking at scattered grain that had been left to rot, and in silence so complete it seemed to mock the very notion of life ever having existed within those weathered walls. It was the smell that led him down the stone steps into the darkness below, a sweetly rotten perfume that spoke of flesh returning to the earth in ways that God had never intended. Reverend Hawthorne's lantern revealed Josiah Miller's remains still suspended from the iron rings, his body a testament to prolonged agony that had finally surrendered to the mercy of death. The sight drove the preacher to his knees in violent prayer, his breakfast expelled onto the cellar floor as his mind struggled to process the calculated cruelty evident in every detail of the scene. This was not the work of robbers or drifters seeking easy plunder, but something far more personal and infinitely more disturbing. Sheriff Marcus Brody arrived 3 hours later, summoned by a message that had traveled faster through the mountain communities than wildfire in dry timber. At 42 years old, Brody carried himself with the weary dignity of a man who had seen humanity at its worst, and somehow maintained faith that justice could still matter in a world that seemed determined to prove him wrong. His weathered face bore the lines of countless disappointments, but his eyes retained the sharp clarity of someone who understood that evil thrived in the shadows of willful ignorance and systematic neglect. The initial investigation followed predictable patterns, with suspicion falling on the usual suspects who haunted the margins of civilized society. Vagrants and displaced men were questioned with varying degrees of enthusiasm, while neighboring farmers offered theories about boundary disputes and old grudges that might have escalated into the kind of violence that left a man chained and mutilated in his own cellar. But Brody's instincts, honed by years of separating truth from convenient fiction, sensed something fundamentally wrong with the easy explanations that satisfied his deputies and the local magistrate. It was during his third visit to the farm that Brody began to uncover the deeper currents of horror that had flowed beneath the surface of the Miller family's existence. In the main bedroom, behind a loose floorboard that creaked under his weight, he discovered a child's doll with its dress torn and its painted face cracked as if it had been thrown against a wall in rage. The toy was clearly handmade, crafted with the kind of loving attention that spoke of a mother's care for a daughter who would never be allowed the luxury of true childhood. Beside it lay scraps of fabric tied with careful knots, arranged in patterns that suggested some kind of desperate communication system between souls trapped in circumstances too terrible for words. The neighbors, when pressed beyond their initial discomfort, began to reveal fragments of a story that painted Josiah Miller as something far worse than a stern patriarch struggling with the burden of raising daughters alone. Martha Henderson, whose farm bordered the Miller property, admitted with obvious reluctance that she had heard screaming from the direction of their house on more than one occasion, sounds that came most often in the deep hours of night, when decent folk were supposed to be sleeping peacefully in their beds. "I told my husband we should check on them," she confessed, wringing her hands with the guilt of inaction. "But he said it wasn't our place to interfere in a man's discipline of his own family." The pattern of willful blindness extended throughout the sparse community, creating a conspiracy of silence that had allowed unthinkable horrors to flourish unchecked for years. Store owners recalled Josiah's rare visits to town, always alone, always hostile to questions about his daughters who had once been such bright, cheerful children before they disappeared behind the walls of isolation that their father had constructed around his property. The local doctor mentioned treating suspicious injuries on the girls years earlier, wounds that Josiah had explained away with stories of accidents and clumsiness that became increasingly difficult to believe as they accumulated over time. Following leads that grew colder with each passing day, Brody's investigation eventually brought him to Copper Falls, a mining town where questions were discouraged and the past was considered a luxury that few could afford. He arrived to find a community gripped by a fear that had no name but manifested in locked doors and suspicious glances, a paranoia that seemed to center around the mysterious disappearances of several men over the past months. The local constable, a man named Garrett whose badge carried more authority than his competence deserved, dismissed the missing men as drifters who had simply moved on to more promising prospects elsewhere. But Brody's trained eye recognized the patterns that lesser lawmen missed, the connections between victims that pointed to deliberation rather than coincidence. The missing men shared certain characteristics. They were all known for their rough treatment of women, all prone to violence when drink loosened their inhibitions, all the type of males who moved through the world with the casual cruelty that marked them as predators in human form. The realization that someone was hunting these men with calculated precision sent a chill through Brody's soul that had nothing to do with the mountain air. It was at the boarding house that he first glimpsed Sarah and Mary Whitfield, two young women whose faces triggered a recognition so profound it nearly stopped his heart in his chest. Despite their efforts to transform themselves, despite the careful alterations to their appearance and bearing, Brody saw through their disguises with the clarity of a man who had been carrying their childhood photograph in his coat pocket for weeks. The image, found hidden in their father's belongings, showed two innocent girls whose smiles had not yet been crushed by the weight of their circumstances, and the contrast between that past innocence and their present reality hit him like a physical blow. When he approached Ilara in the boarding-house parlor, presenting her with the faded photograph, as if it were evidence in a court of law, her carefully constructed composure cracked like ice under sudden pressure. The mask of Sarah Whitfield fell away, revealing the damaged soul of Ilara Miller beneath, and for one terrible moment both hunter and hunted stared into the abyss that separated justice from vengeance, understanding from condemnation, the broken from those who had broken them, beyond all hope of repair. The photograph trembled in Ilara's hands like a leaf caught in a storm, its faded edges worn soft by years of handling, its surface a window into a past so distant it might have belonged to different people entirely. The two young girls captured in that sepia-tone moment smiled with an innocence that had been systematically destroyed, their eyes bright with hopes that would never be fulfilled, and dreams that would curdle into nightmares before their childhoods had properly ended. Sheriff Brody watched her face as recognition dawned, seeing the careful mask of Sarah Whitfield crumble to reveal the broken soul of Ilara Miller beneath. And in that moment of terrible clarity, both hunter and hunted understood that their shared tragedy had reached its inevitable conclusion. "I know who you are," Brody said softly, his voice carrying the weight of weeks spent piecing together the fragments of a story that no one had wanted to tell. "I know what he did to you and your sister, and I know what you've been doing to the men who reminded you of him. The question now is whether you're ready to stop running from what you've become." But before Ilara could respond, before she could find the words to explain the inexplicable or justify the unjustifiable, Maeve appeared in the parlor doorway with the silent grace of a predator who had learned to move without sound through years of necessity. Her hand gripped a kitchen knife with the familiarity of someone who had discovered that violence could be a solution to problems that words could never solve, and her eyes burned with the same cold fury that had sustained her through the darkest moments of their shared ordeal. She saw Brody as just another man trying to control their destiny, another authority figure who would drag them back to face consequences they had never deserved in the first place. "No one is taking us back to that place," Maeve hissed, raising the blade with the practiced efficiency of someone who had learned to kill without hesitation. "We're not victims anymore, and we won't be caged like animals for cleaning up the world's mess." Her voice carried the brittle edge of someone who had convinced herself that violence was virtue, that their campaign of murder had been a righteous crusade rather than a descent into the same darkness that had consumed their father. But in that crucial moment, as Maeve lunged forward with the knife aimed at Brody's heart, Ilara made a choice that shattered the toxic bond that had defined their relationship since childhood. She threw herself between them, not to protect her sister from the consequences of their actions, but to protect Brody from becoming another casualty in a war that had already claimed too many lives. The blade that had been meant for the sheriff found its mark in Ilara's shoulder instead, sending both sisters tumbling to the floor in a tangle of limbs and desperation. What followed was not the calculated violence they had perfected in their campaign against the men of Copper Falls, but something raw and desperate and heartbreaking in its futility. They fought like children again, clawing and screaming with an intensity that spoke of years of suppressed rage and competing definitions of survival. Maeve's fury was absolute and uncompromising, while Ilara's resistance was driven by the sudden, devastating realization that they had become the very monsters they had once feared. The struggle ended when Maeve's own knife, turned against her in the chaos of their desperate grappling, found its way between her ribs with the kind of cruel irony that seemed to define their entire existence. As her sister's life bled out onto the boarding house floor, Alara knelt beside her with tears streaming down her face, holding Maeve's hand as the light faded from eyes that had seen too much suffering and inflicted too much pain in their brief passage through a world that had shown them no mercy. "I'm sorry," she whispered, though whether she was apologizing for their father's crimes, their own descent into darkness, or the necessity of this final, terrible ending, even she could not say. Maeve's last words were barely audible, a whispered confession that sounded like forgiveness or condemnation, or perhaps both at once. When Brody placed his hands on her wrists to bind them with gentle authority, Ilara offered no resistance, surrendering with the exhausted relief of someone who had finally found a burden too heavy to carry any further. The trial that followed became a sensation throughout the Arkansas territories, drawing crowds of spectators who came to gawk at the young woman who had carved a path of vengeance through the mining camps and backwater towns where decent folk feared to tread. But more importantly, it forced the community to confront its own complicity in the horrors that had spawned such terrible justice. Brody's testimony about the years of abuse the Miller sisters had endured created a reckoning that extended far beyond the courtroom, exposing the network of willful blindness and systematic neglect that had allowed Josiah Miller to torture his daughters without interference or consequence. Neighbors who had heard screams and chosen silence, officials who had ignored suspicious injuries, and an entire social structure built on the assumption that a man's authority over his family was absolute and unquestionable. All of it was laid bare before a jury that could no longer pretend ignorance about the forces that had created such desperate killers. The verdict was guilty as charged, but the sentence reflected a community's grudging acknowledgement that justice was more complicated than simple retribution. Ilara was spared the gallows that would have claimed a male killer without hesitation, receiving instead a term of imprisonment that would allow her to live with the weight of her choices while serving as a reminder of the price that society paid for its failures to protect the vulnerable. 15 years later, Sheriff Brody, now gray-haired and bent, with the accumulated weight of cases that had tested his faith in human nature, made his way through the corridors of the women's prison where Ilara had spent the better part of her adult life. He found her in a small courtyard garden that she had cultivated with the same methodical care she had once applied to darker purposes, tending rows of vegetables and herbs that provided both sustenance for the prison kitchen and something approaching peace for her tortured soul. She looked up at his approach, her face lined with years of contemplation and hard-won wisdom, her eyes holding depths that spoke of suffering transformed into something resembling understanding. On a wooden post beside her small plot of earth sat a familiar carved sparrow, its wings still spread in eternal flight, weathered by time but unbroken by all that had transpired since that long-ago day when hope had briefly taken wing on the Miller farm. "Hello, Sheriff," she said quietly, her voice carrying the calm authority of someone who had finally made peace with the irreversible choices of her youth. In that simple greeting lay the acknowledgement of a journey that had led from victimhood through vengeance to something that might, in time, become redemption.